In just a few hours, at 8 p.m. Eastern tonight, the fragile 14-day ceasefire between the United States and Iran officially expires. Donald Trump has publicly said he is highly unlikely to extend it and warned that lots of bombs start going off if there's no deal. Iran's foreign ministry has responded by stating it has no plans to re-engage in talks, with Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf calling the entire negotiation framework a table of surrender. And the consequences for Europe, from your gas pump to your next flight, could be enormous. So, in this video, we're going to explain why a deal looks almost impossible, what happens when the clock hits zero, and why this moment may be remembered as the breaking point that finally forced Europe into genuine strategic autonomy. So, let's begin with how we actually got here, because the timeline matters quite a lot. The US-Iran war began on February 28th this year, with joint US-Israeli airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. After roughly 6 weeks of escalating conflict, including the fastest oil price spike in modern history, with Brent briefly hitting around $126 a barrel, both sides agreed to a 14-day pause on April 8th. However, the ceasefire was fragile from day one. For context, just 5 days into the truce, the US imposed a full naval blockade of every Iranian port, intercepting at least 27 ships along a line running from the Iran-Pakistan border down to the UAE. Iran has consistently argued that the blockade itself is a ceasefire violation, which means the two sides have spent the entire 14 days disagreeing on whether the ceasefire was ever genuinely in effect. Things then escalated dramatically last weekend when, on April 19th, the USS Spruance fired on and disabled an Iranian-flagged cargo ship, the MV Tuska, in the Gulf of Oman. The U.S. claimed the vessel was carrying dual-use materials, while Iran condemned the seizure as maritime piracy. A planned second round of indirect talks in Islamabad, involving J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner on the American side, collapsed almost immediately. Anyway, on top of all of this, there's a deeper structural problem inside Iran itself. On April 17th, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi publicly declared the Strait of Hormuz completely open, only for the IRGC to immediately contradict him by firing on commercial vessels, including ships operated by CMA-CGM and 2 Indian-flagged tankers. The Institute for the Study of War has assessed that the IRGC has effectively sidelined the moderate civilian voices in Tehran, which means even if Araghchi wanted to sign a deal, the Revolutionary Guards have demonstrated they can veto it in real time with gunfire. So this brings us to where Europe sits in all of this, and why the continent is uniquely exposed. Roughly 20% of the world's oil and LNG normally flows through the Strait of Hormuz. As of yesterday, only 16 ships made the transit, down from a pre-war baseline of around 130 a day, with hundreds of vessels and roughly 20,000 seafarers currently stranded in the Gulf. Europe is far more exposed to this than the United States, which is now largely energy self-sufficient. The continent has historically relied on the Middle East for around 75% of its jet fuel imports, and European refineries are specifically calibrated for the Kuwaiti and Iraqi medium-heavy sour crude that's now offline. This is why IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol warned last week that Europe has roughly 6 weeks of jet fuel reserves remaining if the strait stays blocked. To be fair, the Dutch government has pushed back on this, estimating closer to 5 months of supply if reserves are pooled. But the airline numbers tell their own story. KLM is cutting 160 flights in the coming month. SAS scrapped around 1,000 flights in April alone. Lufthansa is retiring 27 short-haul aircraft ahead of schedule, and EasyJet is now forecasting a pre-tax loss of up to £560 million for the first half of the year. Now, all of this has triggered what European officials are privately calling the worst crisis in NATO's 77-year history. Spain's Pedro Sanchez has barred the U.S. from using Spanish bases for Iran operations, calling the campaign unlawful. Italy's Giorgia Meloni has denied the U.S. access to the Sigonella airbase. Germany, Poland, and Greece have all ruled out sending naval support, while France and the UK are leading a separate 40-plus country mine-sweeping coalition that explicitly excludes the United States. Trump's response has been to delay previously contracted weapons deliveries to Baltic and Scandinavian allies, label NATO absolutely useless, and revive his threats to seize Greenland. It's also worth noting that European NATO members are now reportedly simulating defense operations that exclude the US altogether to stress test their own mutual assistance mechanisms. So, what actually happens after 8 p.m. tonight? Well, broadly speaking, we think there are three scenarios worth taking seriously. The first is a quiet de facto extension, where neither side formally agrees to anything, but neither side escalates either. This is the option markets are praying for, but prediction platforms are currently pricing only around an 18% probability that Iran agrees to unrestricted shipping by today's deadline. The IRGC's behavior over the past week makes it hard to see how this scenario survives much beyond the weekend. The second scenario is that the US reinitiates hostilities. Trump has explicitly threatened to target Iranian bridges and power plants, and Iran has responded by warning that no port in the Persian Gulf or the Sea of Oman will be safe, with specific threats against Gulf Arab desalination and power infrastructure. Iranian officials have also claimed they used the ceasefire to retrieve missile launchers from underground facilities, which suggests they expect this scenario and have actively prepared for it. The third scenario is that Iran reignites the next phase by firing on commercial vessels and effectively closing the strait. Given that the IRGC has already fired on Indian and French-operated ships during a supposed ceasefire, this scenario is arguably already underway in slow motion. Any of these three pathways pushes Brent crude well past $100 a barrel. Goldman Sachs is warning of a sustained $100-plus average if the strait stays shut, while JP Morgan and Citi are modeling worst cases of between $130 and $150 a barrel. Citi has separately warned that 2 months of disruption could drain global inventories by 1.7 billion barrels, the lowest level in 25 years. So what does all of this mean for the continent in the coming weeks? Well, even if there is a last-minute extension tonight, any deal is likely to be a temporary holding pattern rather than a comprehensive settlement. The 5-year framework Iran reportedly floated would still require well over 18 months of negotiations based on JCPOA precedent, and meanwhile, European leaders are facing simultaneous demands on defense spending, energy subsidies, and Ukraine aid, with the IMF having already revised European growth forecasts downwards. The way we see it, though, the deeper story here isn't really about whether bombs start falling tonight. It's that the transatlantic relationship has now been damaged in ways that will outlast any specific ceasefire. European NATO members have publicly refused to back a US war. The US is publicly punishing them for it, and the continent is being forced to discover in real time what European strategic autonomy actually looks like when Washington is no longer a reliable partner. Whether tonight brings a quiet extension or a return to open conflict, the European political project is going to be reshaped by what happens next. The continent's leaders know it. The question now is whether they can act fast enough. Let us know in the comments which of the three scenarios you think is most likely, and check out our recent video on why another US attempt on Greenland looks worryingly inevitable for the wider context on where transatlantic relations are heading.